Hello and welcome to episode 190 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are talking about RosterMania. Not a lot of official news. There's a lot of tweets, a lot of rumors, a lot of reports, but we have learned quite a bit, even if it isn't all official. A lot of these teams in the CDL seem to be breaking up in some shape or form, but we'll get to all of that. Before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Yeah, doing all right. Like you mentioned, we don't have a ton of official news, but we have heard at least one change on 10 of the 12 CDL teams heading into next season. So, pretty substantial amount of news, whether it is rumors, reports, or whatnot. Last time we went live for an episode was July 28th. So there have even been multiple reports on the same teams going through several things, and gonna try to just recap all of that. And it might even be a case where we're talking about some of the moves on a team that were happening or rumored in early August, and that's already changed since then. So hopefully this will be like a pretty in-depth recap of everything we know so far that's been talked about, at least in the off season, and then by the end of going through all the teams that we know about so far, we should have a decent idea about where everyone stands as of this moment, August 12th, 5:30 Eastern.
Yeah, so let's start with I said this months ago, you said this months ago, that this team is the single biggest what if of the offseason, and that was the Vegas Falcons. This team that we knew, the esports organization Falcon Esports, they have spent really big, specifically in Counter Strike, uh, way more than teams of their caliber typically would. So we knew that there was a possibility that they could end up spending big in Call of Duty as well. We didn't see that last season, although they did sign Pred late in the year, which was obviously a very big deal. But they were the worst team in the league, one of the worst teams in Call of Duty history. So nothing really worked out for them. Now it seems like they've completely abandoned even like I think they'll keep a part of the Saudi influence, but it's certainly a real small minority now, and they are reportedly kicking it into overdrive and becoming potentially the biggest spenders in the entire CDL this offseason. So Vegas is reportedly set to sign Cellium from Atlanta FaZe, obviously, which would be a massive shakeup. That roster with Atlanta has been there for the most part, and Cellium has been a part of that roster since the beginning of the CDL. He's a former MVP, one of the best players in the world annually. They are reportedly going to sign Cellium this offseason. They're also interested in buying scrap out from LA Thieves for a reported, rumored, however you want to say it. The figure that has been floated has been $2 million to get Scrap out of his contract with LAT and get him to Vegas. I believe that Falcons Esports spent about $1 million or $2 million to get Nico out of his contract with. I think it might have been FaZe, coincidentally, FaZe or
I think it was
G2.
G2, yeah.
And then he's obviously a Counter-Strike player, but they spent reportedly millions of dollars to negotiate that deal. And then to kind of wrap it up, because it's so wide span, that they're also trying, or I guess targeting or thinking about either Sib or Ghosty for their roster. So there's a lot going on here. I think we should break it down piece by piece, starting with Cellium. Your thoughts on Vegas Falcons potentially, reportedly signing Cellium this offseason?
Yeah, so I think that's it. It seems like the order that Preston went in seems to be kind of like that's the order of how things happen, and it's also seems like the level of importance for these moves, in my opinion, as well. It feels like Cellium is like the most likely of these three reports that we've gotten on Vegas to become official. It seems like everybody is um like banking on that basically being official, and based on all the the streams and stuff, it's been pretty fun over the last couple weeks, honestly. Like Zuma, Attach, Octane, Methods, like anytime one of these reports drops during the day, they all instantly go live, and then they just sit in a TeamSpeak call and BS for like 2-3 hours on stream talking about the stuff, and I've had a blast watching that, honestly. But it feels like from those conversations and everything in the community, it seems like Cellium got a pretty substantial offer from Vegas, and it almost feels like an almost certainty at this point that he will be a part of Vegas Falcons for the 2026 season. The scrap thing seems like less of a certainty. Even the number, like I think TackRab did a video yesterday, or maybe it was on Dope Check Podcast for Breaking Point, saying that like it never got up to 2 million, but it was around $1 million offer, allegedly, reportedly, for scrap, just as the buyout. Not even getting into what his contract would look like. But it feels like that's not going to happen, and it seems like now we are more in the territory of Sib being that potential fourth member at this point. Also feels like Ghosty is more linked to another team, which we will talk about later. So in a long-winded way, right now it feels like the roster is Pred and Xnid, then like 95% locked in Cellium, and then maybe like a 40 to 50% locked in Sib. Um, we've already seen one clip. I don't know if everybody's seen it, but there was one clip after the Cellium news dropped of like Cellium and Xnid just getting in a call and saying like what's up to each other, and it was like a 20-second clip, and they could both like seemingly not understand each other very well. So that immediately jumps out as a possible concern with this roster. Obviously, Cellium is known over the years as an incredibly talented player, but everyone, Methods in particular, does his like impersonation of him talking very fast and having some hectic communication. So that, in my opinion, jumps out as a potential issue with this Vegas team. Which was why when the report came out that Sib or Ghosty could be the potential fourth, I like the idea of Ghosty as the fourth on this team, because I feel like Ghosty would be able to be like more of that in-game leader in terms of comms and everything that we've heard from him over the years. He seems pretty calm, cool, and able to maybe rally these troops and get them on the same page despite language barriers and whatnot. So yeah, that's immediately my first concern with this team is the communication. Um, Feels like this team has a great recipe. If it is truly Cellium, Sib, and Pred, that's like three all-star caliber slayers, and this team should be very good in hardpoint. The problem, though, is all three of those guys are primarily slayers, and it feels like a lot of the OBJ, like just sitting in the hill in hardpoint, that pressure would fall on Xnid. Um, so I think that's another thing we would just have to evaluate with this roster. But overall, if this is the way things shape up for Vegas, I think it is interesting that seemingly Xnit is sticking around, keeping at least one of the Saudi players from the original Vegas Falcons roster from earlier this year. And they're surrounding him with three literal all-stars and three top slayers. Um, you know, I am a little worried on how they would play in S&D. Like obviously Cellium's a really good S&D player. Pred and Sib have prior you know, history teaming together on Seattle Surge, and notably they had some good search and destroy moments, but a lot of those did revolve around accuracy, the Iceman like having some clutch moments in search. And that's not to say that Pred and Sib aren't good at search, but I feel like they are more well known for their prowess in respawns and hardpoint and slaying. So that's kind of where my initial thoughts are with this team. I think a lot of star power and a lot of slaying power, but I am worried about the not necessarily the chemistry, but the communication and how everything pieces together in totality if this is the roster that actually gets finalized.
I am also concerned about the S&D part of it, just because if I remember correctly, there was a lot of concern when Pred joined Optic that he would not mesh the best with Shotzi, I believe it was, Shotzi or Dashi. And that just like the certain play styles don't really mesh like 1-to-1. But that's probably something that can be worked out. But I think early on it could be a point of concern. But just to be kind of like a counterweight to what you said about the OBJ work, being such a big part of Xnid and everybody else being more Slay heavy. I think the same probably could be said about that Optic roster that won the World Championship last year, where you bring in, you obviously have Shotzi and Dashi come in, but you have Kenny, who I think was probably in the Xnid role of like, he's not going to get that many kills. He's going to have to do some of the other dirty work. And Pred was brought in of like, you are pretty much in the same vein of Dashi and Shotzi, where people are expecting you to drop big kill numbers. And I think there was some, kind of that push and pull at different points of the season. But ultimately, they kind of worked it out. They figured, when you're so talented, I think it's a little bit easier to be like, okay, I'm gonna hang back a little bit. I don't need to get 40 kills this map. So maybe that's something that can be resolved for Vegas if this is the roster. If it is something along the lines of Cellium, Xnid, Pred, and either Sib or Ghosty, it's just a very interesting roster. All things considered, whether it is Sib or Ghosty, I don't think it really matters in that regard. I don't know how it will all work out, because we've seen with these really talented rosters that, the ultimate goal was to win a world championship. And that is increasingly difficult with how talented Atlanta FaZe likely still will be. Optic Texas certainly will be. LA Thieves certainly will be. There's just so much talent at the very top that I think it will be difficult for them. And we've also really never seen Cellium outside of this Atlanta FaZe system. He was with FaZe Clan in 2019 in Black Ops 4. And that was a 5v5 game. That was also his rookie year, if I'm not mistaken. So there's so many things that we really haven't seen from him. And he's been asked to do pretty much the same exact thing for 5 or 6 seasons in a row now. So that does, there's cause for concern, I guess. But he's a really talented player regardless. He hasn't played with any of these guys at like a ReeaL level, because Ghosty was on Optic and then LA Thieves. Sib was on the FaZe Academy, and I think he subbed in.
Yeah.
So like he probably knows Sib, but like how much he's actually played with him and like worked with him is probably up for debate. If they were able to get Scrap, I don't like, obviously if you get like Cellium, Scrap, and Xnid and Pred, like they're an automatic world championship contender. But again, that calls in the same question of like, how do these roles fit? How will they play together? And like, will the egos almost be too big for this team where you have 3 players that realistically could be MVP any given season? So I think there are a lot of questions about this team, but I'm so happy they're doing it. I'm beyond ecstatic that we have another big player in the CDL. And that was something that we talked about quite a few times actually during the season, was like, obviously Vegas sucked in 2025, but if they're willing to spend money, then that gives LAT, that gives Atlanta and Optic, Toronto to an extent, Cloud9 if they're willing to pay for it. It gives all these other teams something to really compete with. And not just like the same old, same old. So I'm very excited about that. But yeah, there are some pretty glaring questions about Vegas as they move forward.
There are some people, and I've seen a lot of, back and forth on the timeline since this RosterMania has kicked off, who aren't as enthusiastic about the Vegas alleged spending spree, for lack of a better term. And there are obviously the outside factors and political ramifications, however you want to classify that. But I tend, I have over these last couple weeks, I get where people are coming from, but there was one tweet, and I didn't put it in the doc, but it was one tweet that was basically like using Vegas as an example. It was like, when it was Vegas Legion and they weren't spending money, people in the community were, getting up in arms about, that sort of thing, like a lack of showing motivation to try and put a contender together.
Cheapskates.
And then Vegas Falcons comes in and does the opposite of that, where they're now seemingly, doing the sports washing thing or whatever, and trying to invest heavily, and people are up in arms about that. So I think it's another case of, you can't please everybody. I do think, and I think this is like almost like a teaser for next season. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but that's what a lot of people in the conversation in like some of those streams that I mentioned earlier has been, is like, if this is what's going on in this RosterMania, imagine next RosterMania when Scrap is a free agent, Hydra is a free agent, potentially some of the Optic guys, potentially Simp, like if they're willing to offer this possibly 1 million plus buyout for a guy. Imagine what happens when that buyout isn't even involved and they can just offer a massive sum of salary without that buyout component in it. And that's obviously another year down the road, but yeah, I think that is an element of this that should be addressed, and I don't really have any super strong feelings about it either way. I do see both sides of it. um but from a strict Call of Duty perspective, I do feel like having another team, regardless of the situation, that is willing to invest heavily into putting a contender together should, in theory, be a positive for the competitiveness of the league.
Yeah, we look at this from a fan's point of view. We are not Hex's accountant or LAT's accountant. Like, I do not care if they make money. I want them to make money. I should be clear on that. I want them to be able to be sustainable and operate kind of a healthy organization in Call of Duty. I want that for everybody in the CDL. At the same point, I do not give a damn if they lose money and stay in the CDL. I do not want the Vegas. I do not want the Paris Legion. I don't want the Vegas Legion. I want the $1 billion Vegas Falcons. I want them to be spending big and forcing the other teams to spend big, even if it comes at the cost of the rest of the league, because that's not my job. My job is not to be like the business manager of the CDL. And I'm sure there are a lot of really concerned people around the league and other teams or in the league office. Like, I'm sure people at Activision and all that are like not too pleased about this. Because that just drives up the wages and the salaries of these players, because the players talk to each other. They know exactly how much Cellium is getting from Vegas now, and they're like, well, I mean, that is my starting point for my next contract with Optic or FaZe or LA Thieves, and all those organizations now have these rising salaries that they have to deal with. Again, I don't care. Like, that's not my job. But it's another point that it happens in traditional sports too. This is kind of like a big argument against allowing certain owners in the Premier League, for example, where there is no salary cap. So these kind of oil states like the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates and so on and so forth, Qatar, they all come in, they buy these soccer clubs, they inject like hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into these teams, and they drive up the price for a lot of these players on the open market. And a lot of these other teams were like, we can't compete with that. Like, we're going to go bankrupt. And some teams actually have gone bankrupt because they try to compete with these really high wages and it just doesn't work out for them, which is unfortunate. But I think that's just the way it is, unless you, like, the CDL can do something about it. They could engage the players in as like a player union and say, hey, you guys should like collectively bargain with us and we can create a salary cap and make this more sustainable. But they don't want that because they don't want a player union. So like, there's a lot of trade-offs that they're kind of sacrificing here. But again, at the end of the day, like, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you're the Vegas Legion, you get shit on rightfully because you never spent money, and you get called out by your players of like, no, I don't want to have to be like a management member while being a player just to get $40,000 a year and play in the CDL, as Clayster kind of alluded to during his contract negotiations. And I think that's the right way to frame it. At the same point, like, you're damned if you're the Vegas Falcons and you spend reportedly millions of dollars per year to put out a maybe it's not even a championship roster, like you're saying. Like maybe there is some kind of barrier where they don't become this championship team that we think, but they're trying to compete. So you can either be the not Oakland Athletics, but the Sacramento Athletics or whatever they call themselves now.
Just the Athletics.
Yeah, or you could be the Miami Marlins or the Pittsburgh Pirates, or you can be the Dodgers and say like, screw it, like we're paying Ohtani all of the money. Hawaii, real estate be damned. Ipe Mitsuhara be damned. We're going to pay him billions of dollars. We're going to pay Blake Snell all this money. So like that's really what it comes down to is like you can't care about what other teams or players or organizations or agents, what any of them think. You just have to do what's best for your organizations. And it's kind of the same deal with LAT, is it not? Like LAT 2 years ago said, well, we're going to be financially responsible. We're not going to spend a lot of money. And then a year later, like, screw this, super team, assemble. And they pulled all this money together, whatever they did. Nate Schott said he isn't taking salary anymore, whatever the case may be. But they decided for whatever reason, even though it's certainly not become more profitable a year later to do the things that they did, but they said, screw it. Like, we're just going to put the best players possible together to try to compete for a world championship. And they failed in doing that this past season, but they were one of the best teams and had a really good shot at the end of the year. So, yeah, I'm very happy about this. I continue to be excited about what Vegas could be, even no matter how this goes. But I think it's important that we kind of it is important to like put it in the context of like there are going to be some really unhappy people with this roster, and I'm not one of them. I don't think you are one of them. So it doesn't really matter in the Ego Chall podcast world, but I'm sure there will be some complaints on Twitter about these high salaries or whatever, but that doesn't really matter. But all this is kind of coming together because of the confluence of factors. Like Cellium becomes an unrestricted free agent, I believe, in free agency this year. Yep. You have Scrap. Obviously, he's if he does go, that's just Vegas saying we're gonna spend all this money. He's not even technically a restricted free agent. He is just like on the roster, and he's like, there's really nothing you can do about that part of it. But Ghosty is a restricted free agent. LAT has kind of set like they allowed Envoy to be an unrestricted free agent, Ghosty restricted free agent. So they are even saying, hey, like, yeah, we were the number 1 seed going into champs, but the way the season ended, we can't, we're not happy with that. So, maybe there could be some changes there, which I think was very interesting. The reports, though, that it could be Kenny and it could be Abizi, that is, I mean, I'm just gonna say it. I think that's a horrible idea. Like Ghosty and Envoy out, Kenny and Abizi in. However you think about these players, like I just think they had a really good thing, right? LAT this year. They won 2 majors. They won a minor. They were the number 1 seed at the end of the regular season, and they screwed up at the end of the year. Unless it's like irreparable, like they just blame Envoy or Ghosty for just being like the worst players in the world, or like they couldn't work with them anymore. There's like a real chance that Kenny is not the player that he used to be, and like that should really scare LAT. And Abizi is kind of like in the same boat. Like there is some concern with like how some of the past few seasons have went, that he isn't like the MVP well, he's certainly not the MVP candidate that he was a few years ago. So like, what do you think about this? Just it's obviously not confirmed or anything, but like this possibility that Kenny and Abizi could replace Envoy and Ghosty on LAT.
Yeah, so the Kenny component is definitely interesting to me, and obviously I think very highly of Kenny as a player. But I do think, this past season, if this past season did like irreparable damage to his stock or his like standing in terms of what other players think of him, I wouldn't have been surprised. But obviously that doesn't appear to be the case if he's potentially getting an offer here from LA Thieves. And I do think that is the interest. It's not like yes, he has a connection with LA Thieves. Or he won a world championship with, his first world championship with. But it's not a case of like Envoy is still here and Envoy wants to bring in a guy like Kenny that he formerly teamed with. There were also those reports of like Kenny and Draza wanting to reunite, potentially
Yeah.
even go to Toronto. So if it was a case of like Kenny returning to LA Thieves with one of those like players a part of the World Championship LAT roster, I wouldn't have been as surprised. But this part of it, where it just seems to be Kenny and Abizi at this point, that does interest me a little bit in terms of, you know, it's clearly a situation where, you know, the guys, and at this point it's got to be Need Shot, Scrap, and Hydra, right? I guess Sender and Shane would have some say too, but like the people involved with LAT would seemingly be saying like, yeah, we're not putting much stock in what happened with Kenny last year. We'll chalk it up as a fluke, and we're going after one of the guys who's one of the best Call of Duty players ever, and hoping for a strong bounce back season in Black Ops 7. Um, I do think overall for LA Thieves, it is the way this has kind of happened so far in the offseason with them, where like the initial report was they were going to stick together. Then it became like a report of, okay, we're maybe going to move on from Ghosty.
Hmm.
Then the Scrap stuff kind of slid in there. And after that is when it was like, okay, we're going to kind of move on from Envoy. And then we get this report of Kenny and Abizi. Um, the way this like kind of unfolded over these 2 weeks is a little interesting to me, that it went from literally sticking together with the super team from last year to replacing half that roster. um and I think the main ingredient, and I haven't really talked about it yet, is a Beezy. And from everything I've heard in these streams and whatnot, it feels like Abizi to LAT is more a result of Abizi just being done with the former FaZe trio, and wanting to move on from that. It feels like there was an opportunity, because Abizi is a restricted free agent with FaZe. If he wanted to return to FaZe, it feels like they possibly could have worked out a way. But from all of the reports and everything we've heard so far, it feels like it's just more of a case where like Abizi is ready to move on, split up the Tiny Terrors, and try to pave his own path in a different team, all that stuff. Um, so I think that's the interesting component, and it feels like that in that case, I get where you're saying about, you know, Envoy and Abizi, but I feel like it you know, I like both of them as players, and I think highly of both of them. But I feel like Abizi is an upgrade over Envoy, no matter which way you look at it. And if he becomes available to a team like LA Thieves and they're able to, you know, grab him, like I feel like that's an opportunity they can't pass up, and that might be what happened here. Like they may have honestly planned on sticking together, then this Abizi situation unfolds, and it's like, well, if we got a chance to pack a punch and pick up Abizi, like we're gonna take a swing at it. And maybe it's a case of, you know, Kenny stock is potentially down a little bit, so they got to spend more money on Abizi and then spending less money on Kenny. I don't know if they would do that. Again, there's that prior relationship between 100 Thieves, LAT, and Kenny. So
Yeah.
um, I don't know, long-winded way of saying this is a very interesting situation. I'm still not fully convinced this is, uh, you know, if we go live whenever the next time we do an episode and there's a different roster for LA Thieves, I wouldn't be surprised. This seems like similar to what I did with Vegas. It feels like, you know, it's Scrap, Hydra, and then right now it feels like it's like a 90% confirmation that Abizi's going to be there, and then the Kenny component isn't as solidified to me, but it feels like he hasn't really been talked about for any other teams outside of that like Draza and Kenny uh, duo report, but obviously that's not happening here. Um, so yeah, I'm not totally sure what's gonna happen. I do really, I mean, the thought of a Beezy and Hydra playing
Yeah.
together, it has to be incredibly scary to some of these teams. So I do really like that. Like you, I would be, you know, if Kenny is locked in on this team, you have to be banking on a bounce back season from him in a big way. Uh, and yeah, that'd be, you know, this is really, like I was kind of saying earlier, it feels like, you know, with the offer to scrap from Falcons uh this off season, what would next season look like for LAT? Would they be in a situation where they're losing all of their guys for free and they have to go through another, quote unquote rebuild? Like, I don't know how much that's going to be a factor in this offseason and what this roster looks like for this season for LAT. But if this is the roster, I just think, you got the MVP in Scrap, you got another MVP in Hydra, someone who could have won MVP in Abizi, two-time world champion in Kenny. I mean, that is the formula for a winning roster. I'm not sure how it would all go together, but they would immediately be unquestionably one of the best teams in the league.
It just seems like an overreaction on, from my point of view. Like, we screwed up the end of the year, and therefore, like, we're axing half of this roster. And I think that's, like, it happens. Like, obviously, I think most teams do this. But usually it's, like, definitive upgrades at both positions. So, like, not only are we taking out Ghosty and Envoy, but we're replacing them with definitive upgrades in both positions. And that is not, like, it's definitive that Kenny is not better than Ghosty. Like, it's not. Like, I'm picking, like, current Kenny, obviously, current Ghosty. Like, if Kenny reverts back to 2022 or previously, okay, like, what are we talking about? Like, obviously you would pick the guy who's, like, leading LAT to a world championship, but that was 3 years ago, and he struck. Like, it can't be ignored how bad he was with Optic this past season. And Minnesota Kenny was different, but he was not like this game changer, and it wasn't like this immediate upgrade for Minnesota where they even made it to champs. So again, like, it's just a big risk, I think, for LAT, a team that, if you're keeping Scrap and you're keeping Hydra, you obviously think you can win a world championship, and that's your goal, is to win a world championship. Why would you not just keep Ghosty, and then if you want to make a roster change, replace Envoy with Abizi? Because then Abizi's already played with, like, this dynamic SMG duo in Simp his entire career. So it's like, it seems kind of like a seamless fit in a way for Abizi to come into this roster. I just don't see Kenny being the guy to, make a big difference with the Thieves. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just completely overlooking his talent and, like, completely overrating Ghosty. But I think if LAT were to stick with the roster, the trio of Ghosty, Scrap, and Hydra, and then bring in Abizi for Envoy, that could be a really, really big and beneficial move without taking the risk of bringing in Kenny and really relying on him having a bounce back year, when that's never guaranteed for any single player in the CDL, especially when you're going from Black Ops 6 to Black Ops 7, and Kenny probably had his worst season as a pro in Black Ops 6. Like, that's a really big risk from my point of view. But we should talk about FaZe because this is all interconnected. Vegas, LAT, FaZe. Yep. So FaZe's, like, entire roster, aside from Simp, are free agents. Draws is unrestricted free agent, Cellium is an unrestricted free agent, and Abizi, like you said, is a restricted free agent. So technically, they could keep Abizi and, run it back, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest there in doing that. And understandably, we talked when they had this really disappointing end to the season like LAT, that it would not be a surprise if there were roster changes coming, especially because they're trying to get back to that world championship level where they won in 21. They got to the world championship finals in 20, and it hasn't worked out. These last 2 years, they've had these really, really bad champs placings, some of their worst placings, not only at champs, but, like, in terms of any tournament in the CDL era, have been these past two champs appearances, which is obviously not what you want when you have one of the most talented rosters in the entire league's history. But despite Draza being an unrestricted free agent, there is seemingly a chance that he returns and teams back up with Simp, and maybe something like 04 and Obuza coming from the Vancouver Surge over to Atlanta FaZe. I have no idea what to think of that roster, because that's not even something my brain had even formed a thought for. Like, I didn't think, like, what would Simp and Abuza look like together, or Simp and 04. I never really thought about these players together.
Yeah.
What have you thought about this? Obviously, you're big fan. We're both big fans of what Vancouver was able to do this year. How do you think these players could potentially mesh with Simp and Draza?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Vancouver because that's really like the only way I've been able to kind of think about this is I really like when I heard the first report of like O4 and Abuza to FaZe with Simp. This was before Draza reportedly returning was reported. So when it was like just that, when it was the team of three reportedly of Simp, O4, and Abuza, I was pretty concerned, and in the back of my head, I was like, this just doesn't feel like a FaZe roster. It feels like it's a, no disrespect to O4 and Abuza, but it felt like a downgrade. I think that's just safe to say, just because of,
It's Cellium and
how
VZ.
historic the FaZe roster has been, and yeah, and um, what Vancouver did this last season, making it to the grand finals, but not able to get over the hump and cash in the championship. Um, that's kind of the way I've been able to think of it, in the sense of like maybe this is like FaZe really sees the talent and opportunity for O4 and Abuza to like push them over the edge and take them from these guys who were able to get to grand finals, come over to FaZe, we'll get the championships. That's got to be the way they're looking at it, in my opinion. Otherwise, uh, I'm just not entirely sure how to feel about this roster. Um, with Draza returning, I do feel a little bit better about it. I'm not entirely sure how the dynamic of Simp and O4 working together would be. O4 has been pretty active in the chats of some of those guys I mentioned, like Zuma, Attach, Method, and all that, and talking about their thing at EWC and towards the end of the year is like we're blitzing and being like super aggro and stuff. So maybe it's a case of O4 comes in and fills that Abizi role where he's just going in first ahead of Simp, and it's like nothing ever changes. But I obviously, um, that would really be the one uh, element of this that I'm looking at and trying to examine, is how Simp works with any new SMG player, whether it's O4 or somebody else, just because it's literally the first time we've had to even have that conversation since the CDL began, or since Simp's career began. He's never
Yeah.
truly had another SMG duo. Um, so yeah, I definitely think, if this is the roster that comes together, it would be the first time in basically ever where I wouldn't be thinking about FaZe as, an immediate contender for championships at every single event like I have historically. Like, going into any event, you can find some way to convince me that they are the team that's going to win it, and I'd probably side with you. Um, I feel like with this roster, if it is Simpo for Abuza and Draza, I would have to. It would take a little bit more convincing for me. I'm not going to bet against Simp, and I am. If everything happens the way that we've heard so far, I would be super excited for that first showdown between Simp and Abizi. It opens up massive narratives for us. Like, it's basically it, not the exact way, but like Jordan and Pippen splitting up, Shaq and Kobe splitting up, and then you're able to look at what their careers look like when Simp and Abizi played together versus after they went their separate ways and are on different teams. So, um, I'm excited for what this RosterMania and the changes the FaZe means from a narrative perspective, but from a gameplay perspective, I am kind of, I'm just not super sold on this FaZe roster right now. But obviously, like I said, O4 and Abuza had a really good year this past year. Getting to those grand finals, just not able to actually win them. So they obviously have the talent to compete at the very top level.
Yeah, I don't know what to think of this team. Regardless, like no matter who replaced them, I guess, unless it was like Scrap and Ghosty and Hydra or whatever, unless you're just building another super team with Simp at the center of it with all these other great players or other like superstar players, then like I don't really know. My brain again can't comprehend like even Simp being with another SMG player. Like it's been 6 years since I saw him with any other like main AR player, like other than like RCDs and stuff like that. But um, yeah, it just is. It's kind of hard to even visualize how this team could perform, and that's a honestly a great thing because we like FaZe has been this constant for so long, for the most part, and now they're kind of an unknown if this roster does come to bear, or some kind of variation, and I think that's very exciting. I think we should also talk real quickly because it is kind of connected in a way. Is Vancouver is dismantling, like blowing up is
Yeah.
probably the best word for it. Um, every player on the roster, Neptune, Nasty, Abuza, and O4 are all free agents. Rambo is reportedly leaving the organization, and in their place, they are reportedly targeting the Omit roster that we just saw at the Esports World Cup, which was Vivid, Mamba, Craze, and Mac. Obviously, that would be a return to Vancouver for Mac, or return to the Surge for Mac. Um, I mean, that's great. I want to see Craze, Mamba. I think Vivid, like whatever you think about his stats or whatever, like it didn't really matter because Carolina was demonstrably better with him than without him. He performed pretty well, all things considered, at the Esports World Cup. Mac, I think, is like if he's in challengers, he's one of the best players in challengers, like pretty much at all times. It's just when he goes up to the CDL, like how much of an impact can he make? And he has made a big impact, over the years. It's just last year was not his best season. I Man, it kind of sucks to see Vancouver blow it up, and for this to happen. But I think that they're probably in a position, if I had to guess, that it's just going to be too hard to keep all of these players. Like they're all going to get big offers. If like we
Yeah.
said, if Abuza and O4 are getting courted by FaZe, like Neptune and Nasty are definitely getting offers as well from these from other teams. What do you, and I'm sure Rambo as well, because Rambo has the success of being a former Optic coach and Empire coach, and now being a former Surge coach as well. So what do you think about all of this?
Yeah, I thought, and you know, kind of looping it back in with FaZe there. I thought Neptune, if any
Yeah.
of the Surge players potentially would go to FaZe, I especially if it's to replace the BZ, I really thought Neptune would have been that guy, and because I feel like Neptune and Simp would have really worked well uh, together as an SMG duo. But obviously, there seems to be thinking otherwise and going after O4 and Abuzo. Like, hey, that's FaZe's position. I'm not gonna doubt them, but I am kind of surprised. It feels like there's been a lack of, for a while at least, there was a lack of chatter around Neptune, and there was apparently in some of those streams they were talking about potentially some drama at EWC where like Neptune was like, you know, going around trying to feel out offers from not feel out offers. I don't know. It was a whole thing. If you, I'm sure people listening have seen it on Twitter and Reddit and whatnot. It's basically, Ben J was saying that there was potentially some stuff going on behind the scenes with Neptune and the old Surge roster, and then O4 was in the chat saying it wasn't true, and Neptune was denying it too. So I don't know what the case may be, but regardless, it feels like for how highly both of us thought of Neptune in this last season, feels like the lack of chatter around him has been, there's just been a lack of chatter around Neptune for a good portion of this offseason that seems to have changed recently with Gentlemates, which we'll get to them eventually. But um, yeah, that was kind of the most surprising thing. I would have, I think we said it last time we went live. Like you could have made a case for all the Surge guys sticking together, but
Yeah.
obviously, like you said, if they're getting offers, some of these guys are getting FaZe offers. Like they're not gonna turn down an opportunity to go to a team like that. At least in my eyes, I would have a hard time seeing a situation where you turn that down. But the other component of this Surge thing, which it seems like maybe it is a case of them entering another rebuild, maybe looking to save some money or whatnot, whatever the case may be. Um, this potential for them to sign the omit roster of Craze Mamba, Vivid, and Mac. That's something you've talked about previously, I believe, of like wanting to get a roster that does well in challengers
Yep.
and keep that roster together and bring it to the next level. Every time we talk about it, I'm always like, yeah, it just doesn't feel like there's an opportunity, especially once you get into the season and all that stuff. It feels like this is like the closest we've been to it actually becoming a reality, where we have a challengers roster that saw success in challengers move together to the next level. Obviously, Vivid and Mac have that previous experience in the CDL, so it's not like 4 challengers players doing it, but
Yeah.
like this is the closest that it's ever been to actually becoming a reality in my, as long as I can remember. So I would be really excited if that is the roster. Oh, sorry. If that is the roster that comes together for Vancouver, which also I think that was um, maybe that was just something mentioned on stream that they might not have to compete from Vancouver in this upcoming season, which I think that was a part of the team last year. They played from Vancouver, and that had some issues for them in the online portion of the season. So that could be another selling point for a potential challengers team like this that's looking together. But also, just if this is a team like Omit and they want to stick together and they get an offer to do so at the next level, it feels like this is a pretty good, all around landing spot. An organization that seemingly is looking to spend a little bit less and gives an opportunity to a full team that saw success in challengers. I like the end result if this is how it comes together.
Yeah, I think it is. Um, it is probably the best chance that we have for a challengers roster. It has to be in the off season because if you have a really talented mid season challengers roster, they are getting poached to death until that roster is unrecognizable. So it's kind of like the perfect timing. There's Craze and Mamba who have been kind of on the radar for several years now, and Vivid and Mac are like well respected players that have been able to compete in the CDL for a number of years. They've been able to produce something. Like Mac was a part of those really good Surge rosters. Vivid, I mean, Carolina was actually a pretty good team when Vivid was on the roster, which is pretty crazy. So yeah, it's kind of the perfect place, perfect time for this to happen. So if it doesn't, then it's probably never going to happen, or it's probably going to take at least a few more years for something like that to happen. So we'll see what happens with the Surge. Miami is kind of depressing in a way because they, like Vancouver, we both talked about it and said like this is a team that realistically could run it back if they were determined and believed that we actually could win. Like we could have some kind of success with this roster. There was a chance that they could run it back. That is not the case. Metals, unrestricted free agent, and the more bizarre scenario, of course, has to do with our boy ReeaL. So I guess it kind of depends on like what who you ask and like what who's a turncoat or whatever. But ReeaL was reportedly close to re-signing with Miami, and according to Miami, actually verbally agreed to a deal to return to the Heretics. However, and this is according to the Heretics in what might be the weirdest official team statement in CDL history. So I'll paraphrase and I'll quote where it is actually necessary, but basically Heretics put out a statement on August 10th, which was Sunday, if I'm not mistaken, Sunday morning, and they said they talked about how they are a Spanish-speaking roster, a Spanish organization, how that's very important to them, and how they didn't get into the initial CDL, and that it was kind of this huge moment to come back to the CDL in after 2023 season, and they've been in the league the last 2 years is doing so. And then they go into this thing about ReeaL. So they said, this 2025 season, after a significant generational change, we experienced the best year in our history. With a young and promising group, we felt emotions that no Spanish team had ever made us feel before. I mean, some of this is translated, obviously. Despite the interest these players attracted from other teams in the league, we were determined to keep the project. However, yesterday an event occurred that, in addition to preventing the continuity of the roster, we believe it is important to share. On August 9th, ReeaL verbally accepted the conditions he himself had requested to renew his contract with Miami Heretics. In esports, verbal agreements are a common practice and traditionally are respected by agents, players, and teams. Just a few hours later, while we were working on drafting the contract, rumors began to circulate on social media claiming that the player and his agent had signed with another organization. So far, and despite our insistence, neither the player nor his agent have confirmed the breach of this verbal agreement, although we understand from third-party statements that he has already signed with another team. We want to express our full understanding of a player's decision to change teams. However, we strongly reject the breach of verbal agreements as it damages the trust and respect that should prevail in our community. To our community, we reaffirm our commitment to the continuity of continuity of the project that started in 23 and our firm determination to keep working for and with the Spanish-speaking Call of Duty community. So that is a long-winded way of saying ReeaL got a better offer late in the negotiations process, allegedly, and said, yeah, I'm not turning down this big ass offer from reportedly Toronto. And peace out, Miami. Love you very much and appreciate what you did for me. But 2 years ago, I was with the Carolina Royal Ravens, stuck in Europe because of my visa situation and could not be in the CDL. And now I'm getting offered a bunch of money by Toronto. That is kind of the read on the situation from my point of view. Maybe it's different than reality or whatever. This is just a bizarre statement, though, to put out publicly. To one, verbal agreements are verbal agreements. Like, they mean something to some people, but nothing to some other people. And they're kind of like I know, like, people say like handshake deals and verbal agreements are like binding by law and stuff. I don't know if they really want to go to court with this stuff anyway. Like, this is pretty shaky at best. And, like, it's competitive Call of Duty. I just don't know if that is the best way to go about it, to like force a player to stay in your organization because he verbally agreed to it, even though he certainly does not want to be part of your organization anymore. So all things considered, not a great situation for anybody. I don't think like ReeaL had this idea of like, haha, I'm going to screw them over, I'm going to agree and then back out of the agreement. But they should not have put out the statement. They should not have publicly probably said anything. They should have voiced their displeasure with like the CDL or like privately with whatever organization there was, maybe to negotiate a buyout and say like, hey, like give us a small amount, like so we don't like escalate this or anything. Maybe that could have worked, maybe it wouldn't. But just a really stupid decision to make as an organization, and it didn't really help them at all because it seems like ReeaL, according to reports, is going to sign with the Toronto Koi, not the Toronto Ultra. There was, reports that he was offered 3 times his salary with Miami to join Toronto, which is that's a good deal, I would imagine. Like I might break this verbal agreement I have with you to continue this podcast if, I don't know, like Dope Check offers me 3 times the salary, which 3 times 0 is 0, but I don't know, like we'll figure it out. I just I don't know like how you could really blame anybody or blame. I actually can't blame anybody. I just think like the statement was stupid. What do you think about this whole situation with ReeaL and Miami and Toronto?
Very bizarre situation. Like the statement from Miami, it feels like it's like sort of like a backhanded way of like trying to go after ReeaL and try and like rally
Yeah,
the
they're trying to
Miami
shame him.
fan. They're basically trying to like rally the fans and be like, hey, it's not on us that he left. You should still be fans of us and you should hate him now, that sort of thing. And that I just don't, and regardless of the exact outcome and everything that happened behind closed doors, at the end of the day, ReeaL has been a huge part of this Miami turnaround over the last 2 seasons. And I think it was even a JCap who tweeted it. It might not have even been in reference to this, but it was sort of like it's one of those things that's talked about in real sports too, where it's like if a player doesn't show loyalty to an organization, they some people, I can't think of it, but it was one of those things where it's like if an organization isn't loyal to a player versus when a player isn't loyal to an organization, and that sort of debate that's always talked about in real sports and whatnot. Um, I just think at the end of the day, it feels like this is a situation where ReeaL was basically in a bidding war and like leveraging the two situations, like Koi and Miami against one another, and he was like, seemed like he was going to go to Koi, went back to Miami. Miami was like, okay, we'll match this Koi thing. So then ReeaL goes back to Koi and's like, yeah, I'm going to go to Miami because they're matching this. And Koi's like, okay, we're going to bump it up more. And then ReeAL's like, well, shit, I can't turn that down. So he probably went back to Miami. He was like, hey, Koi's giving me more now. And Miami just wasn't willing to go that extra mile. And, end of the day, that's a bidding war. It seems like, we don't know exactly how it played out last year, but the whole gentle mates and LAT thing for the super team last year, like that's a thing that happens, you know, seemingly multiple different situations. It feels like this is a little different because there seems to be a bit of a rivalry between the Koi and Heretics brand slash organizations.
Yeah.
Another element of this that's been a little difficult, at least for me personally, is just a lot of this bickering and back and forth on Twitter and posts and whatnot has been in Spanish. So there's been a lot of translated posts, and you obviously can't fully uh, trust like the Google Translate and whatnot on some of these posts. So that's, end of the day, we might not get the full picture. I did see ReeaL did an interview with Attach. I didn't watch it, but I saw he just did that yesterday. So maybe there's some more behind the scenes info there that we can possibly gather on the situation. But as far as we know, yeah, I think it's obviously unfortunate for Miami in the sense of, not being able to keep this roster together that had a pretty strong end of the season. But at the end of the day, especially you, I think you're going to agree with me here. You got to feel good for ReeaL getting acknowledged in terms of potentially signing a lucrative deal for himself, and we both think highly of him as a player. So I'm happy for him in that sense. There were even rumblings very early on. I don't think it was ever like officially reported and whatnot, but a lot of people were saying like maybe Rencor could go to FaZe or Rencor to LAT and stuff like that. So it was like it felt like very early on, even before this ReeaL situation, the Miami roster wasn't going to stick together. But now it feels like it's going to be Rencor Super Medals +1. The +1 element is a little interesting because there is a rumor going around that it could be Snoopy. It feels like he's like the top priority, but then it becomes a question of whether Boston would actually move on from him or not. If I'm in Boston's situation, I probably am holding on to him after, they've already committed to him for so long. Like, it feels like if they just give up on him.
This is like they're literally at their peak right now with him.
Yeah, so I don't know how that'll all shake out. Maybe that's another bidding war that comes down, and we'll have to wait and see on that. But for now, at least, as far as Miami goes, this is another situation where maybe this sets up more narratives and whatnot for next season when we get Toronto versus Miami. Could add a little more fire to that matchup, and we get some more fireworks out of it. But we can kind of talk about Toronto here too, as we're lumping in ReeaL. If ReeaL is playing alongside Joe, which Joe Deceives has been a big talking point this offseason, and Toronto has seemingly made it very clear they don't want to move on from him. So an SMG tandem there of Joe and ReeaL is pretty scary, and then potentially Kleenex on a flex. Like, if in a world where Black Ops 7 is a 3 SMG meta, Joe Deceives, Kleenex, and ReeaL on the subs, that's a lot of sub slaying power.
Yeah, I mean, it's like these rosters are really interesting. I want to go back to the Miami thing or Miami Toronto thing because I did not think about it before this all went down, but it is true. Like, they are organizational rivals. Like, we don't think about Miami Heretics and Toronto Ultra being rivals like in the slightest, because like who cares? Like, they never play each other like in these big matches really. But organizationally, Koi and like Mad Lions, which I don't think they operate anymore. I think it's all under Koi if I'm not mistaken. But Overactive has like this real big base in Madrid, and Heretics is based in Madrid as well. So like there is that rivalry where they are kind of competing directly against each other, and I'm sure Miami does see this as like a direct shot by Toronto to get their best player from them in free agency like this. So, but yeah, I agree with you on that. Like I'm happy for ReeaL. I have very little sympathy for organizations in general. I think like this is just like the price of doing business. This is how it works in traditional sports. This is how it works in esports. It is not clean. It is not nice, but this is just how it goes sometimes, and it doesn't always work out maybe the way you wanted it. And even me, like I wanted to see what this roster for Miami looked like if they ran it back and they were able to kind of just build off the success that they had this year, even because they didn't have this exact roster the entire year. So I figured maybe they just run it back, but obviously that's not the case. And, it is what it is. As for Toronto, they are really interesting because if it is, like you mentioned, ReeaL, Joe, and Kleenex as a trio, I mean, that's as good of a trio as they could probably put together, to be honest. And then it's just about like who is that fourth? Who is going like if you screw up on the fourth, it's obviously going to fall apart, and it's probably going to be something like they had this year where they're competitive, but they're not a competitor, they're not a contender, and they don't really have like the chance to compete for championships. But if they really nail the fourth and they're able to get whatever AR player there is, like I mean, just thinking, if Ghosty doesn't end up on LAT, he doesn't end up on Vegas, then you're probably competing with Gentlemates, I would imagine, for Ghosty. He would be kind of like a guy that you have to look at and say, like, let's go and try to get him. Like, we have ostensibly some money, because we sold off of our players last year. We'll see what happens this offseason because they have Abe under restricted free agent. Maybe he signs a contract and they get, they're not going to get buyout from that, but they're not paying him anything either. So like maybe they are able to kind of scrounge together something and get Ghosty or another high level AR player, which could kind of transform their team and put them in that contender status, especially if FaZe is kind of on shaky footing where you're not exactly sure. So I think there are a lot of different avenues they go down, but that trio of ReeaL, Joe, and Kleenex is a really, really strong one.
Yeah, the Abe thing is an interesting situation, and there was a tweet from the Toronto owner saying that like I'll just read it off. We extended Abe's contract because we want the kid to stay, but if there's interest and he wants to leave, we're not looking to charge a buyout. In this case, restricted means he could choose to stay with us. It's his backstop. So taking that at face value and assuming that is a truly, like a truthful statement, like that's a pretty cool move by Toronto because based on what we've heard from their dealings in the past and whatnot, it it could have been a situation where they're just like they've allowed players to explore their options in the past and haven't held them back or anything like that. But it could have been a case where they were just like, yeah, this guy Abe played well for us at EWC. He could be one of those next up quote unquote players. Let's put a buyout around him and try to make a quick buck, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So that is seemingly a good thing from Toronto. Shout out them. I could very easily see a situation where he is like the fifth man or the sub for Toronto heading into this next season. But from a roster construction standpoint, that is a little concerning to me, just in the sense of again, if the roster as we know it right now is Joe Deceives, ReeaL, Kleenex, +1, and then Abe, that's effectively 4 SMG players. Whether you want to classify Kleenex as a flex or whatnot, or regardless, even if you don't, that's 3 SMGs and then a flex with Kleenex. So it is a lack of ARs if we are entering a game that is uh, an AR heavy meta. So that's the trade off, I guess, when you're looking at this team. Like right now, if it's an SMG favored meta in Black Ops 7, I really like where this Toronto team's going. But if it is a little more AR favored, it might be a case where like Joa and ReeaL have to show off some talent with an AR that we haven't necessarily had to see from them yet. But I wouldn't put it past them to be able to succeed. Um, but yeah, the latest thing, I think it was just today, was that Insight is an unrestricted free agent now. There was, again, on those streams today with methods and attach, was some rumblings of Ghosty potentially being a target here for Toronto. I think Benjay even said that he signed it wasn't a verbal agreement. Oh, he signed a letter of intent with Gentlemates, reportedly, allegedly, potentially. Um, so then they got into a whole thing there where they were talking about like, well, what's the point of a letter of intent if it doesn't really mean anything? And Ghosty can just go sign with Toronto now, yada yada. So, um, it will be interesting to see how that situation plays out. But end of the day, right now, as far as Toronto stands, I really like where they're at right now. Um, but that fourth signing is going to be crucial, and I really, I want them to find a strong AR player who can be that lockdown main AR, which they just don't have right now on this current roster. And bringing it full circle, the early reports from early in the offseason with Toronto, where there was potentially, obviously I think highly of Kleenex, and his name was mentioned in some of the reports, but when it was potentially going to be Kenny, Draza, Abizi, and Joe Deceives, I actually really liked that concept for a team. It feels like from a financial standpoint that might have been a roster that was more expensive than what Toronto has historically been willing to pay, or just in recent years been willing to pay, as exemplified from last offseason, where they weren't willing to keep the roster together of Kleenex, Insight, Scrap, and Envoy, and obviously that led to Envoy and Scrap going to LAT. You all know that. So yeah, end of the day, I did think, that would have been Kenny, Draza, Abizi, and Joe Deceives. It felt like we've talked about it before. Abizi and Joe Deceives playing together felt like that's something they wanted to do. They're pretty good friends. And I felt like as a duo, they'd work well together too. Kenny and Draza obviously have that father-son relationship that they've joked about before, and they have the historical success with LATs previously. So that would have basically been like two duos coming together on Toronto. I really would have liked that team on paper. Would have felt weird for Kleenex to have been left out of that. And, we even had that thing last episode where we were talking about like Kleenex saying he's, feels weird about not wearing an ultra jersey anymore. Seemingly that's because they're now going to be Toronto Koi. But in a world where that roster came together and Kleenex was on the outside looking in, would have been interesting to see how that played out. But now, from everything we've heard, feels like it's going to be Joe Deceives, ReeaL, Kleenex, looking for one, potentially Ghosty, but end of the day, that looking for one, if it is those three players, they got to get a really solid AR player. Not entirely sure who that would be, but I'm interested to see what this roster will look at like when it's all said and done.
Yeah, it's just a really tough question to answer for them because there aren't that many great AR players on the market that aren't already seemingly going to another roster. Like obviously Cellium would be great, but he's going to Vegas. And there are a bunch of other, if Ghosty is, like you said, he signed the letter of intent, however that works out. If he goes to Gentlemates, yeah, just that idea that obviously really hurts because they need an AR player. Like that's obviously like the only thing that could really make or break this roster. And there's just not that many that are out there that really fit with the caliber of roster that that trio would have. But like that's a super important role. You can't just overlook it. I don't know if like Geo would be an option just because he's out there. He obviously is very talented. There's a lot of criticism of him, and he hasn't had the team success. So there's always going to be that kind of hesitance in some way of like, well, maybe he's just not a team player and he's not going to help us win. So I don't know what the deal is there, if it makes actual sense for them or whatever. But I think there's some options. There's just not that many of them, which is unfortunate for Toronto, for how they build this roster.
One thing I just thought about that as a result of this whole ReeaL and Miami situation is maybe this is a case where Toronto's looking ahead a little bit, and obviously that's a little risky, so I don't think it's the case because in terms of Joe being a hot commodity this offseason, if they don't sign him to some sort of extension, he's a free agent next season. Is this a situation where if Toronto's looking for AR players, maybe ReeaL is able to recruit Rencor or Super from Miami next offseason, and where we get like a little bit of a Heretics migration to Toronto, and that would fuel more narratives too. But I think that's jumping the gun a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I did think about like what if Rencor goes to Toronto, but then Miami's never going to go along with that. Like, no matter if they got this massive buyout, they would just like, screw yourselves. Like, we're cool over here. So it's just one of those situations. Like, it makes a ton of sense. I'm sure Rencor would love it. Just from like the competitive aspect of like, I'm going to this team that has like a real chance to compete for championships next year, but my organization is never going to let me out of it, like in a million years. And I mean, that's just how it goes. Like I'm sure there's a lot of that going on in the CDL. Like, FaZe is probably not going to be selling a lot of their players to Optic and LAT just because, for different reasons, but they don't want to give these contenders or their direct competitors something to kind of toot their horn about. So we've gone through most we've gone through most of the league at this point. We're getting close. We're well over an hour, I think, now at this point. But Gentlemates is kind of like the last big conversation, I think, because we look at Cloud9, they've basically just overhauled, like they've just said, okay, like we're done with this roster, we're resetting, which is unsurprising. I think the only big surprise probably was Gwyn because he came in for Esports World Cup. We thought, okay, maybe there is like a path, and maybe there still is, but maybe Gwyn could move forward with the C9 roster as kind of like they're building around him. Minnesota, they've kind of wiped their whole roster except for Estriel. Boston, we'll see what happens with Snoopy. That is like a really big domino for them. Obviously the biggest domino, but Awakening is an unrestricted free agent. We haven't heard from Carolina. It would be shocking. Like it would just be shocking in general if they don't kind of blow it up or if they just don't go with the roster that they had planned for Esports World Cup before that fell apart. I don't see anything happening with Optic at all this offseason. Like, that would be pretty stunning. Other than that, like, Gentlemates is the thing because,
Yep.
They're not in the same boat, but like kind of a dinging or whatever they call them. Like, they're on an adjacent boat with Vegas where they could be like an unexpected player in free agency and kind of shake things up. Where it makes it more difficult for LAT and Optic and FaZe and Cloud9, etc., to really just take all of these big free agents. As we mentioned, Ghosty has been linked to them as kind of like a potential option. There have been a lot of players linked to Gentlemates. How much will actually work out is that just kind of depends on. I have no idea what it depends on, but it depends on something. They are cleaning house. I think we talked about this on the last episode that they had pretty much decided like we're kind of done with this team and we don't really want anything to do with them. There was like a chance reportedly that Ojani was going to be kind of like lingering on that roster. That didn't really make a ton of sense at the time, and since then he is a free agent. Potential targets for the Gentlemates, according to reports: Abizi, Draza, Ghosty, Joe, Neptune, Nasty. Pretty much any worthwhile free agent has been targeted reportedly by the Gentlemates. Obviously, if Abizi and Joe and Draza and all these other players go elsewhere, that doesn't leave them with too many options. But I do think it would be interesting if they're able to get that Vancouver, the leftover, so to speak, even though Neptune and Nasty are both great players. If they were able to get that in their team, if they're able to get Ghosty, I think that would be very interesting. that would set them up for a very, honestly, a great offseason for this team. What do you think of the potential stuff that Gentlemates could be doing as they try to completely distance themselves from what happened in 2025?
Yeah, for starters, the initial rumblings at the beginning of RosterMania were pretty funny. There's this whole thing where like Gentlemates fans were going in Joe Deceive's Twitch chat and they were um, spamming hashtag M8win. Gotaga even rated him with a bunch of viewers, rated Joe Deceives, and then I don't know if it was the Adam guy from Toronto, but somebody from Toronto or Koi rated Joe Deceives like right after Gotaga did. That whole interaction was pretty funny. But and like Gentlemates fans have been doing uh, like Photoshop jersey swaps for like Joe Deceives, Abizi, Draza. I saw. I can't remember if there was a ghosty one, but there's been a lot of funny interactions, I'll say, out of that whole situation at start. But from what we're hearing now, it seems like none of those guys are going to end up being Gentlemates players for this upcoming season. Feels like it's another situation where Gentlemates is in the running and in the bidding for some of these top, quote unquote, top free agents or available players. Uh, and they're in the running, but they're just not going to be able to cross the finish line, and they're going to have to move on to another plan. But that being said, this current report of potentially being Ghosty, Neptune, Nasty, and Envoy,
That's nice.
I actually really like this roster.
Yeah.
I think Neptune and Envoy working together, that really I feel like that's like a pretty good sub duo in the sense of like that this would really be like a prove it opportunity for Neptune in the sense of like he came into the Surge last year and he was able to be a star, but now he'll be if he is playing alongside Envoy. Envoy is like that perfect complementary SMG to potentially elevate Neptune to the next level. With Ghosty and Nasty as an AR duo, I like that potential slaying power. It could be questioned, but this comes full circle with that whole Ghosty thing that I've really talked about for these last couple years. The cycle for Ghosty has been superstar dropping massive numbers in challengers, slaying numbers, gets picked up by Optic, becomes like a quote unquote role player, does the OBJ work, doesn't have to drop massive slaying numbers, goes to LAT in that rebuild year, becomes an all-star caliber player, dropping massive numbers. Then the super team comes in, he goes back into being able to fill that role playing opportunity when he's got the MVPs around him. He doesn't have to drop the numbers, so maybe people are forgetting he has that in his back pocket. And this year becomes another opportunity in the cycle for him to step up in the slaying department and be that superstar slayer on this team alongside Neptune. Um, so that's my thinking with this team. I do think, in terms of like, a hierarchy for all these teams that we've listed, these guys would be like one of those top teams that's not in the like S tier or A tier. They'd be like the top team outside of A or S tier, in my opinion. But I think this would be a squad that has a lot of potential, really good fundamentals, and really good comms, especially with Ghosty and Envoy. And I think that's really important, especially for a team like this that doesn't, necessarily have a guy who's like, a quote unquote superstar uh, in terms of like contract offers and buyouts that we're hearing and all that stuff. So yeah, I think this is a situation. If this is the roster that comes together for Gentlemates, um, I'd be pretty excited to see how it plays out for them. A lot of components of this team that I am interested in. But the ghosty element does seem to be a little tricky right now. By the next time we do an Ego Chall, it's very possible we're talking about ghosty on another team, whether it is Toronto or Vegas. So it feels like he's the one that's like up in the air the most. And that could be another major domino that triggers a whole different set of moves than everything we've talked about for the last hour plus doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, if it falls apart with Ghosty for Gentlemates, I think like the whole roster kind of falls apart. Like it can still be a good roster. I don't want to mistake that, but like he takes it from like, yeah, like, you guys might, you're like sixth, like seventh, maybe in the league, like throughout the year, like maybe a little higher at certain points, a little lower at certain points, but like decidedly middle of the pack. With Ghosty, you can actually beat some of these top teams, like, and it doesn't seem unrealistic. I would like right now, if Ghosty, Neptune, Nasty, Envoy, if that's their roster and they lock it in, like I can't decidedly say that FaZe will be better than them. I can say that Optic should be better because they just won the world championship. LA Thieves, because that would obviously take Ghosty off the table. Then if they go with Kenny, I think they could beat LA Thieves, like not like on a consistent basis probably, but I mean actually if they're continuing LAG's magic, then they will beat LAT very consistently. But like then everybody else, I think there's not that strong of rosters across the board at the moment, and that would also leave Toronto without an AR player, and that who knows how they fill that role. So they actually could be like a top 4 team right out of the gate if this is the roster. It just depends on if this will be the roster, and specifically if Ghosty will be a part of this roster. So I think it's an interesting scenario. I would love for them to be competitive. I also think this is just like the natural landing spot for Rambo Ray. This feels like the team, like he would be going to a French organization. He's French Canadian, obviously. He speaks French, or French Canadian, and like he knows half of this roster very, very well. I assume he knows Ghosty. Like, I don't know how well. I don't think they overlapped like that much
I'm trying
that
to
year.
think of the whole bowling saga.
Yeah, like they know each other, I'm sure. I don't know like how much they actually work together. I'm sure he and Envoy know each other to an extent. They haven't worked together, but that kind of bridges the gap though, because Ghosty and Envoy just played together, Nasty and Neptune just played together. So like they have chemistry with at least one person on the roster. I think that just helps in general in forming the overall team chemistry. If you bring in Rambo, like he was able to do something with Vancouver. Like if you don't give him any credit, I guess, like then whatever, but that team just finished second at Esports World Cup and champs. They went to basically all of the grand finals they could without winning this season. So like he fits like a glove, it seems like, with this roster. I'm very excited if Gentlemates is able to make this their team, but it feels like there's a long way to go, and there's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts with this RosterMania in general.
Yep. I don't remember. I think VOs is confirmed as like the quote unquote head of Call of Duty or whatever for Gentlemates, but I know there was the report of Mayhem joining for EWC. I just don't know if he was like signed beforehand or for longer, or if that was only an EWC thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that also changes it. If it's VOs, we haven't seen him with any kind of resources. Like he put together a pretty talented roster for the time with like Estriel in whatever that was, 2023. But like, he didn't have the resources, of course, to make a championship level roster, and maybe that changes the calculus for him and how he approaches roster construction. The other stuff, as we talked about, C9, they have cleared house. There's nobody left on that team. Accuracy's out as head coach. So they have like they're like an open book right now. I don't know if they actually are planning to spend anything, if they're just going to be like, well, this isn't the off season for us. We'll try again next year. I don't know, like that. They don't seem like they have like a great avenue. Minnesota is kind of in the same boat. They all of them are free agents except Estriel, which he might be a free agent at some point, but as of now, it's like unknown what he's going to do. They don't really have like a clear path to being much better next year. Boston is very interesting because we said Big Wake, free agent. Snoopy, who the hell knows what happens with him, but if he's gone, like, I mean, they don't really have a path to anything next year. Like, he's the key to whatever success they want. And they squeaked into champs this year, and then obviously had the tournament of their lives at champs. I did see, I don't know if you saw this, like people clowning on them because they did like a behind the scenes video and how they were saying like they were kind of laughing about how bad Optic beat them. I think it was in the winners finals. And I think it was Purge talking about it like, okay, like what are we going to do about that? And people are like, that's not what real competitors do. And it's like, well, I mean, they did beat the crap out of some of these other teams that would be quote unquote real competitors, right? Like they finished third at champs, and I think they did about as well as any team could be expected to do, considering they were a map away from getting to the grand finals of champs. I don't know if you saw that, but it was kind of ridiculous, the things that people say online. But that they don't really have a clear path anyway. Like even if they kept the roster, like they're still in the same position they are this year, and that is they're a fringe champs team. They're really gonna have to scratch and claw to get into champs, and I don't see that changing. Same with Carolina, same with Minnesota.
Yeah, so I think the big thing with these other teams, especially, I'm going to lump Surge in this group now too. So
That's true. Yeah.
Surge, C9, Minnesota, and Carolina, really, because Boston does technically have players as far as we know right now, at least some. But these other teams that are mostly squad wiped, as far as we know, that could throw a wrench in the plans, especially if Surge isn't able to lock in that omit roster. Uh, these other teams like C9, Minnesota, Carolina, maybe even Boston, trying to like scoop up one of those omit guys could completely derail the Surge plan to bring that roster in totality to the Surge squad. So that's something to keep an eye on there. The other thing is like these names at the bottom here, it really feels like these rosters aren't going to be solidified until that first group is solidified, like Vegas, LAT, Toronto, FaZe. Once those guys are actually locked and loaded, as far as we know, then I think we're going to start to hear moves from these other squads at the bottom. And based on what we're seeing right now, it feels like there are going to be some opportunities for some guys from challengers that maybe we haven't heard of, or haven't started a season in the CDL recently. There's also looking at like C9, Gwyn and Kremp, Minnesota with Geo and Nero, even Estriel. Like it's possible that some of those guys are just like mixed and matched, and maybe it's a world where like Gwyn goes to Minnesota with Estriel, and then Geo and Kremp team up, and then Nero is on Boston again, or just for lack of a term, like some of these guys that are free agents and not being talked about, they might just be like spread out among some of these other teams. So that I feel like that's the way RosterMania is going to play out. We got to wait for the top dogs to finalize their roster and everything, and then some of these other teams we haven't heard much from so far, they're going to be probably forming their roster a little bit closer to the actual release of the game.
Actually, like, if we're being honest, it's Vegas. Vegas starts it because it depends on how much they want to spend. If they're willing to spend anything, I don't know, like they could get most anyone except Optic probably, and that means like they set the market and they kind of set their roster, and then every other roster has to kind of be based off of that, and like who's not available anymore. Yeah, so I think Vegas goes 1, and then LAT, FaZe probably go 2, and then it kind of trickles down like Gentlemates, Toronto, et cetera, and then you get down to like the very bottom, like you said, like Boston and Carolina, and these teams that just don't have the money or like the desire to spend the money in like a big way, and or there's just not enough players like to really fill out the roster the way that they would want. But yeah, I mean that it opens like someone. I one last thing, and I think we should get out of here. But Kismet just like not being kind of like involved in some of these talks seemed kind of crazy. I just like he's too good of a player to like be completely ignored. But I mean, I would have been like cool with Kiz going to FaZe, to be honest. Like Kiz and Simp being together would be a really interesting SMG duo. Even him going to LAT and teaming back up with Hydra instead of Abizi would be interesting in my opinion. But he'll probably end up in like Cloud9 or something like that.
I mean, you can even make a case of Kismet on Vegas alongside Pred. I think I mentioned that on one of the last podcasts. Like, that's a pretty lethal SMG duo, too. But that would obviously require Vegas to, like, be willing to move on from Exit. And they don't have to get rid of him. Like, they can... I mean, with the amount of money they're investing, I wouldn't be opposed to them doing an NA Challengers team where it's like XNID and 3 NA players competing challengers, and they got XNID on the bench, and then they're able to have, a full squad and at the top level, and XNID still on the team, still representing Saudi Arabia, just in challengers and continuing to try to improve as a player.
Yeah, yeah. We'll see what happens. It's obviously everything's fluid here. Like the only solid one is Optic. It seems like they're like it just doesn't seem possible that they would make a roster change now. Um,
Yeah.
but that's about it. Like every other team is kind of up for sale or changing in some way, and we'll see probably over the next month or two how those things kind of shake themselves out. I think we're about hour and a half now. We had that technical difficulty in the middle, so I'm not exactly sure. But we've been doing this a long time. We hope that you enjoyed the show. Please like, subscribe, and follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're at more than 250 subscribers there. I know the shows have not been regular at all. I don't know, like the summer is like super hectic for me, or like the end of the summer is super hectic for me, so it just makes it very difficult to do the shows. But the end of summer is actually coming soon, and I will be on like more regular schedule, so that kind of helps it. If we get more information, then we can kind of keep doing these podcasts and keep talking about the rosters as they get confirmed, or we learn more reports or rumors or whatever. So keep an eye out. Follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Preston Byers, and the podcast Twitter is at Ego Chall Podcast. Again, not sure exactly when the next show will be. Hopefully sooner than this one was. So, that's a low bar to keep, but we'll try to be back within the next week or two to talk about whatever it is that happened in the Call of Duty esports space. But that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yep. Thank you guys, as always, for all the support. Like Preston said, schedule is a little fluky right now, but we'll be here whenever there's stuff to talk about as soon as we can. So stick with us. Hope you enjoy. This RosterMania is already off to a pretty wild start, and like we said at the top of the show, like everything we've talked about basically today is just reports and rumors. Nothing's even official yet. So really, all this could change, and we could have even more to talk about in the weeks and months to come. So exciting time period for competitive COD fans and all that. And yeah, just hope you stick with us on this journey. If you got anything that you want us to talk about in particular in terms of RosterMania and stuff, leave it in the comments on YouTube, and we can bring some of that stuff up in one of the future episodes as we're breaking down everything that's added on between episodes. But yeah, until next time, take care, and remember to send the chow.